Thank you all across the country for joining us today. This is such an important webinar. We have really brought together just a terrific group of people who have done this groundbreaking research to share with you. This webinar is about the extra costs of disability, new research findings and policy implications. I will be your overall moderator today, Michael Morris, the founder of National Disability Institute, and will be joined by others that I will be introducing to you shortly. This research is a collaboration of researchers at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, College of Social Work, Stony Brook University in New York, School of Social Welfare, and National Disability Institute. And next slide, please. And this research would not have been possible without the generous funding from a grant from the FINRA Investor Education Foundation. Before I introduce the many speakers that will be presenting to us today, let me turn it back to Hope for just some housekeeping items to help you make sure you're able to fully listen and participate. Hope?
Thank you, Michael. For listening to today's webinar, the audio meeting can be accessed using computer audio or by calling in by phone. If you select computer audio, please make sure your speakers are turned on and your headphones are plugged in. If you do not have sound capabilities on your computer or prefer to listen by phone, please dial 1-929-205-6099 and enter meeting code 856-6327-9870. For captioning, real-time captioning is provided during this webinar, and they can be found by clicking on the CC button in your Zoom controls at the bottom of the screen. If you do not see the captions after clicking the button, please alert the host via the chat box. You may also view captions in your browser at streamtext.net/player?event=NDI. For submitting questions, please use the Q&A box to submit any questions you have during the webinar, and we will direct them accordingly. If your question is not answered during the webinar, or you are listening by phone and not logged in, you may email me at hprice@ndi-inc.org. For technical assistance, if you experience any technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the chat box to send a message to the NDI host or email me at hprice@ndi-inc.org. Please note, this webinar is being recorded and the materials will be placed on the National Disability Institute website at nationaldisabilityinstitute.org/resources/webinars. Back to you, Michael.
Thanks, Hope. And again, thank you all for joining us across the country. I think you're going to find the information you're going to hear today helpful, informative, and I hope provocative. I think it will both raise new questions and, as it should, really challenge all of us to think about what is the impact of the extra costs of living with a disability. You're going to hear from the researchers who have done this groundbreaking research. You're also going to hear from two individuals with disabilities who will talk from their own personal experiences about the extra costs of living with a disability. But first, I want to thank our funder and turn to Gerri Walsh, the president of the FINRA Investor Education Foundation. Gerri is someone that I've known for a number of years now. She is the vice president of investor education at FINRA, in addition to her role as president of the FINRA Investor Education Foundation, where she manages the foundation's strategic initiatives to educate and protect investors and to benchmark and foster financial capability for all Americans, particularly underserved audiences. She was the founding executive sponsor of FINRA's Military Community Employee Resource Group and serves on many other advisory groups across the country in this important area of promoting financial health and informed financial decision-making. Prior to joining FINRA, Gerri was Deputy Director of the Securities and Exchange Commission's Office of Investor Education and Assistance. Gerri, let me turn it over to you to just, again, thank you and provide some opening comments.
Michael, thank you so much for that warm welcome, and thank you to everyone who is here today. It's terrific to be here as this seminal research is being released. I want to congratulate Michael, if I could turn the spotlight back on him. He was the winner of the Foundation's 2020 Ketchum Prize, which is a prize that we give to someone who has made significant and enduring contributions to the field of financial capability, outreach, and research. And Michael certainly, I can't think of a more wonderful and more appropriate honor than for you to have been this year's winner. So congratulations. I just wanted to say a few words about this particular project and why we at the Foundation were so excited when we heard about the research. When we first got a project concept from the researchers for this grant, we immediately thought that this was compelling. All of our early conversations with the research team reinforced this belief, and we were quite frankly surprised that the research question they were tackling, that the work that they were getting ready to undertake had been done in Europe, but not in America. And so at the Foundation, we saw as significant a need for this research as many of you who care deeply about this issue. And, it's really important that we understand multiple dimensions of the extra costs of disability. Doing this research very closely aligns with the FINRA Foundation's mission to empower underserved Americans with the knowledge, skills, and tools they need to make financial decisions throughout life. We do our work through grant making and through partnerships, and I really feel like the work that we've been doing has been both here in this instance. Unlike many of the projects that we fund with respect to research, this research has clear, important, and practical policy implications, and Annette and Stephen and Zach will be walking you through those implications. Another aspect of the project that was, particularly appealing to us at the Foundation is that in addition to other data sets, it made use of the Foundation's National Financial Capability Study, which for any researchers on the call who've not yet become familiar with it, it offers a very deep data set that can be sliced and diced across a variety of demographics. The researchers presented to the FINRA Foundation Board of Directors just a couple of weeks ago, and I have to say I have never seen my board so engaged. They kept talking about this research even after the researchers' presentation was over and that session of the meeting had concluded. So it has just been such a pleasure working with the research team. They did a truly outstanding job throughout the whole grant, and I want to turn it back over to Michael so that everyone can get closer to hearing this terrific new research.
Gerri, thank you so much, and thank you again for the kind words about my award, but my award really is also, like this research, is about really putting a spotlight on a huge group of people in this country, very diverse by type of disability, gender, race, other individual characteristics, that we all in both the disability and financial community need to find better ways to work together to respond to financial needs, build pathways to greater financial health and greater economic participation as well. So let me start off before we turn to the research. We thought it would make sense to just provide one individual perspective, one story. We invited Amy Gatlin, Director of Execution Support and Strategy, the Information Services Group at Citibank. She has worked for Citi for some 19 years in a variety of roles on strategy and reporting, customer service, program management, many different areas. She currently oversees execution support and strategy, which works across divisions and is an organization with a staff of some 7,000 individuals at Citi, covering 75 countries. So I could go on and on about Amy, but do want you to know that she holds a BA degree in economics with honors from Harvard University and a master's in Latin American studies with a focus on public policy from the University of Texas at Austin. I think that among the many things that Amy has done, she has been very much in a leadership role in the areas of diversity and inclusion, and has very much played a leadership role at Citi and other communities where she has been active as well, where she lives. I could probably go further, but I think we thought it would be so great to start with Amy and for you to share some of your own experience with disability-related out-of-pocket extra costs, which I think will really help set up my next turning to the research team to share their findings from this groundbreaking research project. So Amy, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. So in terms of my personal story and as it relates to the extra costs of disability, I was born a congenital amputee missing my left arm below the elbow in the 70s. My parents at the time were trying to find me a place to get a prosthetic as a baby even. I got my first prosthetic arm when I was 8 months old. And at the time in Tampa, there weren't any opportunities for prosthetics for children other than metal hooks. So my parents didn't really want me to have a metal hook. So they looked around and found a place in Ohio, a gentleman who was kind of pioneering in prosthetics for children that were more cosmetically pleasing and that had myoelectrics and other capabilities as well. So starting when I was about 1, they started flying me to Ohio from Florida once to twice per year, because as I was growing, I had to get new prosthetics every 6 months to years because I would outgrow them. So, you know, they would fly our family to Ohio once to twice per year. We would stay there in a hotel for several days, and we would wait there for them to build us a new arm, and then I would bring it back with me. My parents' insurance, which was a good insurance at the time, considered my my congenital amputee condition to be a pre-existing condition, so they did not cover any of it with insurance. So my parents had to pay all of that out of pocket, and the prosthetics were around $5,000 a piece every year, plus the gloves, like the coverings that would go on them, that I had to replace a few times per year as well. I was super active riding horses and climbing trees and stuff when I was little, so I would rip the gloves or go swimming and water would leak out of the glove or whatever, so they would have to replace them. So that was my first, 14 or so years I had those. Then also my myoelectrics I started getting when I was 5 would break quite a bit. So then we would have to go back to Ohio to get it fixed. I finally kind of threw in the towel with myoelectrics when I was 14. I was on a dance team and we were going into a competition and we were doing our practice right before the competition. So I kind of fell down to the floor with this one dance move we did where you kind of catch yourself on your hands in a split or something. And my hand broke off the forearm of the myoelectric. So I remember having to run to the janitor and get my hand taped back on with electrical tape right before the competition. So that was kind of the last straw for me with myoelectrics, although they've come a really long way since then. But because it would keep breaking and I would have to, my parents would have to pay so much to fix it, I just went with a more sturdy prosthetic since then. I still do replace those every few years, but now, ever since I was in college, my insurance no longer considered it a pre-existing condition, and so then I was able to cover it through insurance. As I've grown up, though, and as an adult, the things that I found were that if I'm able to leave work, during work hours frequently to do things like physical therapy sessions or deep tissue massage sessions for the pain and different side effects of kind of doing everything a little bit sideways as I have to do, reaching further with my left side, the change in muscle development between one side to the other, just doing everything in a more creative way, causes a lot of shoulder pain, neck pain, back issues, and things like that. So if I were able to leave work kind of frequently to go to all those appointments, those things would be covered by insurance generally. But I can't with the job I have and the demands that I have. I can't really do that. So I end up paying out of pocket for most of those things and finding private places that will do it after hours or on weekends. So I end up as an adult spending quite a bit out of pocket for deep tissue massages, acupuncture on my neck and shoulder, other types of, special exercise sessions and stuff for muscle development and things. I also, as an adult, when I moved out, when I finished college and moved out on my own, into my own apartment without roommates, I found that I had to out of pocket pay people to help with certain things. Like if you go to IKEA and you buy something simple like a shoe tree that most people could just kind of put together, and it doesn't require construction. You just kind of slide the pieces together or whatever. Can't really do that. So I ended up spending quite a bit out of pocket just to set up a new apartment, having to pay someone to come in and hang a painting, or having to pay someone to come in and just kind of put something together. Now that I'm married, my husband does those things and I'm really appreciative, but it also saves us quite a bit of money. So that's really my story.
Amy, thank you for sharing, again, your life experience. I know we have a slide on the screen that people are seeing across the country. Can you explain the slide with the tiger? I think he has your arm in his mouth.
Yeah, so in Sarasota, Florida, there's a circus museum, and so we thought we'd put my prosthetic in the tiger's mouth and just see if anyone would notice. So we had a little bit of fun with that. And then that top left picture is me holding an octopus that I caught on a fishing trip. Wow.
Okay. Well, again, I think it's a great orientation. One story, one example, one story of millions of stories. Many of the people listening in today are people with disabilities. They have their own story. They have their own story about extra costs and out-of-pocket costs. But we wanted to share with you Amy's story. Before now, let me turn to the research team. The research team includes Zach Morris, Assistant Professor, School of Social Work at Stony Brook University, Stephen McGarrity, Assistant Professor, School of Social Work at the University of Tennessee, and then Nanette Goodman, who at the time of this research was Director of Research at the National Disability Institute. Before I turn to this wonderful team to take you through what they did, their methodology, and what they learned to share with all of us, let me just share a little bit more about them. Zach has a PhD and a master's in social work from the University of California, Berkeley. He has been published in many peer-reviewed journals, and particularly has been interested in a variety of research issues related to disability, and particularly about extra costs of disability, working with and looking at these issues as they've been taken up in other countries. Stephen McGarrity received both his master's and PhD in social work from the University of Georgia. His research also has focused primarily on poverty and disability, particularly around how increasing financial supports and financial access for people with disability improves their financial well-being. Nanette, as I mentioned, was until very recently the research director at National Disability Institute. I've had the pleasure and real enjoyment of working with her on a variety of studies, but she particularly has led studies on closing the disability gap, reforming the Community Reinvestment Act regulatory framework, race, ethnicity, and disability, the financial impact of systemic inequality and intersectionality, and a variety of other reports that have utilized the data set Gerri mentioned earlier that FINRA has made available to researchers, and also a public data set that we have utilized multiple times from the FDIC. So that gives you a sense, a little bit more about these three individuals. And with that, let's let the research team take us through this important research project.
Hi, this is Nanette. And first, let me set the stage. So financial stability is based on three components: income, expenses, and assets. And the image on the right with the balancing rock represents how we think about balancing our personal budgets, with income on one side and expenditures on the other. Next slide. We already know a lot about income and a lot about assets, some about assets, but we rarely consider expenses. As far as income, we know that people with disabilities are less likely to be employed, and then thus less likely to have income from wages. On average, they have lower wages than those without disabilities. They're on average they're more likely to be low or moderate income or live in poverty. But let's remember that poverty is based on income. And relatedly, our means-tested programs are based on that same income measure. But the poverty level is based on the assumption that everyone making a certain level of income requires roughly the same basket of goods to live. But what this research does is it challenges that assumption, and this has really important policy implications. The income measures don't consider expenses or the additional out-of-pocket costs associated with living with a disability. And as a result, they understate the true level of economic hardship for households that include a person with a disability. Next slide. I'm going to turn it over to Zach and Stephen.
Well, thank you, everyone, and thank you. This is Zach Morris, and I just want to thank Michael and Gerri for your support, and everyone here on this really important topic. It's very exciting for us to release this research that we've been working so hard on for a long time. And just to give a little bit more background on our motivation, we know that people with disabilities this is from research that Nanette has published, that are 2 times as likely to find it very difficult to cover expenses, 2 times as likely to have past due medical bills, twice as likely to live in poverty. And we suspect that disability-related expenses, the extra costs, may help explain these inequities. You can go to the next slide. So there was a Nobel Prize winning economist named Amartya Sen who argues that there are 2 distinct kinds of financial disadvantages that people with disabilities experience: earnings disadvantage and conversion disadvantage. So the earnings disadvantage relates to how living with a disability can affect one's income. For example, the challenge of receiving suitable education, accommodations that enables a person to stay in their jobs, or the experience of employment discrimination, all of which make it hard to get and keep a job that pays a livable wage. But for Sen, the earnings disadvantages is not enough to understand the financial challenges experienced by people with disabilities. One needs also to take into account expenses, or what Sen calls the conversion disadvantages that only people with disabilities experience. And this is the focus of our research. This refers to the ways in which people with disabilities require more income to achieve the same standard of living as a similar person, but without a disability. And this is because of the need to purchase disability-related items and services. So a salary of $40,000 for a person with a disability does not provide the same living standard as it would for a person without a disability who does not have to expend scarce resources on disability-related items. So to reiterate the point Nanette just made, the result is that when we measure income, such as when we seek to determine whether someone should be counted as poor for programs such as Medicaid or SNAP, the result is that we are likely to understate the true level of economic hardship, the true level of poverty for households that include a person with a disability, if we do not take into account the additional necessary costs of living with a disability. We can go to the next slide. So we can distinguish between two kinds of disability-related costs: indirect costs and direct costs. So indirect costs refer to foregone earnings that people with disabilities have because they face barriers to work, when a family member has to reduce their work because they need to provide care, right? These are the productivity losses that occur and that are captured in our income measure. The other kind of costs are the direct out-of-pocket costs. Again, this is our research focus. And these refer to the myriad of expenses that people with disabilities encounter. As you've heard from Amy, these refer to personal assistance services, out-of-pocket healthcare costs, extra costs of housing to make a house more accessible and convenient, to make your car, to accommodate your needs, maintaining a service animal, extra costs of food, costs associated with going to work. And there are many, many, many other examples. And I would just tell people to check on Twitter to find many more. Twitter is full of stories around the extra costs of disability. You can go to the next slide. So you can go to the next slide. Yeah, so our goal is to estimate, in this research, is to estimate the amount of direct expenses that people with disabilities on average experience in the US. So to do this, we apply the standard of living approach, which is a method that uses multivariate regression to estimate the additional income required to bring the standard of living of a household containing a person with a disability to the same level as a comparable household without a member with a disability. And so there are many ways to estimate the extra cost of disability, but this is become the, I want to say, the most common international standard, international approach to estimating the extra cost of disability. And so the research question it asks is, how much additional income does a household containing a working age person with a disability require to have the same standard of living as a similar household without a member with a disability? So you can go to the next slide. So to answer this question, we draw on 4 different data sets to make sure the estimates are robust. And we provide an average of the estimates across these 4 data sets. And these are nationally representative surveys of the US adult population. That means they capture the US population. The surveys are the National Financial Capability Study funded by the FINRA Foundation, the US Financial Health Pulse Survey funded by the Financial Health Network at USC, the National Financial Wellbeing Survey funded by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the Survey of Household and Economic Decision-Making funded by the Federal Reserve Board. So we analyze and perform our analyses in each of these surveys. And I think it's important to say here that we define disabilities defined in these surveys due to data limitations as a work-limiting disability, right, which is just one kind of disability. And it's when people respond on surveys that they are unable to work due to a disability. With the exception of the 2015, we also analyzed an earlier wave of the NFCS survey, where we analyzed extra costs according to 6 impairment types, and we'll present those results today. To give an idea of what we mean by standard of living, we developed a composite measure of financial security, which is an approach that has been adopted in earlier papers, including my own, looking at the extra cost of disability, where, for example, we ask respondents, because of my financial situation, I feel I will never have the things I want in life. I am just getting by financially. I'm concerned that the money I have or will save won't last. This is our measure of standard of living. And then finally, we also examined the US Current Population Survey, which is funded by the US Census Bureau and the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, the primary source of labor statistics in the US. And we do so to compare how the rate of poverty for households, including a person with a disability, changes after we adjust for the estimate for the extra cost of disability. So we are releasing our working paper today, as well as a policy brief, and I encourage you all to analyze it. And now I will leave it to Stephen to present our results. So thank you.
Hi, this is Stephen McGarity, and thank you all for being here today. I am going to take a few minutes to discuss some of the key findings from our research. And really, two of the main takeaways from our study are right here on this first slide. The first being that people with disabilities in the US require an estimated 28% more income to achieve the same standard of living as similar households without an adult with a disability. And if you look to the figure here on the slide, you can see that that 28% estimate is the average across all four of the data sets that we examined. And then the individual estimates for each data set range from 24% with the SHED to 32% with the NFCS, all of which are very close. And then one of the other main pieces of information that we want you to leave with today is really what that 28% translates to in the real world for families with disabilities. At the national median income, an extra 28% means that households with disabilities would need an additional $17,690 per year just to maintain the same standard of living as a comparable household without a disability. And that's a pretty significant amount. On the next slide here, if we drill down to some of the subgroup comparisons, we can see that single individuals with disabilities require 36% more income compared to single individuals with no disabilities, and married people with disabilities require 25% more income. The data we used in this research doesn't really allow us to answer the question of why that 11% difference exists between single and married people with disabilities, but we hypothesize that that difference can be accounted for somewhat by the sharing of household expenses and some of the informal care from partners that exists sometimes in marriages. Amy kind of touched on this in the beginning as she discussed the extra cost that she incurred prior to being married versus now that she's married, and sometimes her partner can help take up some of those extra burdens. But we'd also love to hear from some of you on your thoughts about why you believe that gap exists. So maybe we can circle back to that later in the discussion. On the next slide, we also looked at the extra cost of gender, or the extra cost and gender, and we didn't observe any consistent statistical differences in the extra cost for men or women with disabilities when compared to men and women with no disability. But we wanted to include the slide here in the presentation nonetheless, just in case you all had questions about this particular subgroup. Next, we examined the extra cost by disability type as well. And we did this by using data from the 2015 National Financial Capability Study, as Zach mentioned. And we used the 2015 NFCS for this particular question because they asked about the 6 impairment types. And what we found was that adults with 1 or more impairments require an estimated additional 35% income to meet their living standards. And this is important because it captures people with a disability who may also be working, whereas the other data sets we used only captured individuals with a work-related disability, or work disability rather. A couple of other interesting findings from the 2015 NFCS that adults with cognitive impairments were found to have the highest extra cost at 29%, while individuals with hearing impairments had the lowest extra cost at 6%. So one of the things next we started wondering about as we came to the towards the end of our study is what would the poverty rate for people with disability look like? How might it change if these extra costs were taken into account? And so we took the federal poverty level and we adjusted it based on our finding that people with disabilities require 28% more income. And what we found was that the rate of poverty among people with disabilities would actually increase from 24% to 35% if these extra costs were included. And this would result in an additional 2.2 million people with disabilities being included in the poverty estimates and potentially becoming eligible for federal benefits programs. So in the graph here, we provide poverty levels at the 100%, 133%, and 400% levels. These thresholds all correspond to various eligibility requirements for several federal benefits programs. And you can see the blue bars here represent the current poverty levels for people with disabilities, and the red bars represent what the poverty levels would look like if adjusted for these extra costs. All right, so next, like all research, there were some limitations to our study, and we would be remiss if we did not acknowledge those limitations. The first limitation is that the standard of living approach that we used doesn't really uncover the types of expenses that are driving these extra costs. So it does tell us that there are extra costs, but it cannot tell us what those extra costs are. The second limitation is that these estimates provide an average across all people with work-related disabilities, but it really can't be used to identify the extra cost for each individual. So for example, the extra cost might be different by level of severity for disability, but we really just can't speak to that with this current research. Third limitation is that this approach doesn't really help explain how a disability impacts the income of an individual or a family member. For example, if you have a family member who has had to reduce their work hours to help provide care, that lost income from those reduced work hours isn't really captured with this method. And the last limitation that we'll mention is that this research uses what we call cross-sectional data. And that just means it was collected at one point in time. And because of that, the data can't really identify differences between the extra costs for people with long-term versus short-term disabilities, or how those extra costs vary over the course of a lifetime. Despite these limitations, though, the findings from our research do present some interesting policy implications, and these are going to be discussed next by Nanette Goodman and Michael Morris.
Thank you, Zach and Steve. And I've been talking with you for months about this research, but when you see the slides and you start thinking about the profound implications of this extra cost that's quantified, as you said, in terms of dollars, even with the limitations, so much more to learn. But it has profound implications in terms of the way public policy has been created and the way public policy is implemented based on a certain set of assumptions that are very different than this, that really hasn't recognized the extra costs, except in a few instances. So the next stage here, we wanted to talk to you, Nanette and I, about the policy implications. And Nanette, why don't you start with where, yes, in public policy, there is some recognition of extra costs, and as you say, sometimes, and take it away.
Right, so we see this recognition of extra costs in legislation, in administrative rules, and in some of the details of the regulatory structure. So for example, in legislation, when Congress was passing the SSI for children in 1972, they explicitly said poor children with disabilities should be eligible for SSI benefits, quote, because their needs are often greater than non-disabled children. And the ABLE Act recognizes these extra costs. This is in the recently passed in 2014, recognizes these extra costs by allowing individuals to save for disability-related expenses in a tax-advantaged account that's not considered an asset when determining eligibility for means-tested public benefits. And then in administrative rules, this is one of those asterisks, the SNAP, food stamps, exempts people with disabilities, and in this case, disabilities is defined as people who are receiving disability benefits, from a gross income threshold, and allows certain deductions from net income. For people without disabilities, there's a gross and a net income threshold. But this basically allows them to have slightly higher incomes and assets to qualify for SNAP. Next slide. And then in our tax code, There's this larger standard deduction for people who are blind. There's a deduction for impairment-related work expenses for workers with disabilities. And then there's a deduction for medical care expenses that exceed 10% of adjusted gross income. And for all of those tax nerds, I know it's 7.5% this year, but it's supposed to go back up to 10% sometime later. But anyway, but the most clear example of understanding or recognizing these extra costs is in our personal budgets for Medicaid. In some states, and it's really, it's not used very often. I think it's about 11% of people who are receiving Medicaid home and community-based services. But participants under these personal budgets are allotted a customized budget. And these budgets are developed through this person-centered planning process. So basically, through the process, we're identifying the specific extra costs that an individual is facing, and then we're giving them a budget to go and buy the services they need after it's been determined. And the other way that we recognize these extra costs is we provide some in-kind benefits. So instead of giving people money to go and pay for services, we provide services. The biggest examples are Medicaid long-term care and home and community-based services, such as personal assistance services, housing assistance, energy assistance, etc. But the reason I mention these examples is to say this concept is not foreign in our public policy. So when we think about making policy changes to adjust for these extra costs, we need to recognize that we're building on concepts that are already in use. And I like to think about that because it makes policy change in this context seem a little less pie in the sky, for lack of a better way to say it. Next slide. So I want to talk a minute about how other countries address these extra costs. So in the United Kingdom, they have this personal independence payment. And it's a cash payment. It's not means tested. It's not contributory. It's tax-free. And unlike our SSI and SSDI, it's not linked to a person's ability to work. It's available equally to people in and out of work. And what happens is in a health professional, there's different levels of payment, and what level you get is determined by a health professional. There's these regular reviews where they might change your level of payment. And in Australia, they have this national disability insurance scheme, which is relatively new, and it entitles people with a, quote, permanent and significant disability under age 65 to full funding for, quote, any reasonable and necessary support related to their disability. So there's certain restrictions, but the funding is allocated to the individual, and the individual or the guardian chooses which providers to buy those goods and services from. And even Thailand, not what we normally consider, a particularly disability progressive place, but they have a small monthly payment specifically intended to cover extra costs. It's not means tested. It's not based on the ability to work, and it's operated by a well-named National Office for the Empowerment of Persons with Disabilities. This list is definitely not exhaustive. We just want to illustrate that other countries are developing public policies that account for these extra costs. So now I'm going to turn it over to Michael to talk about what we think our policy options are.
Thanks, Nanette. Again, I think this just takes us, as Nanette said, this isn't fresh ground, new ground. There are both examples from other countries, as was just provided, and there were the examples that Nanette went over that have already been codified into law related to understanding that there are something called extra costs, that they exist. And so there are different standards in terms of eligibility or about payments. because of extra costs. But what I want us to think about as a group, and hundreds of you have joined this call across the country, is where can we go with this research? So I think there are two parts of where we go in the future. The first I want you to think about are policy development for the future. Probably not a better time than right now in terms of a presidential election, less than a month away. And certainly everyone is thinking about what areas of policy need to be improved, expanded, changed. So great opportunity to think about policy. And then I will turn back to Zach and Steve in terms of how do we build on this groundbreaking, pioneering research? What are the next stages, next generation of research studies that can build and amplify on what is being learned from this first study? So first about policy implications. And as many of us know, eligibility for many types of public benefits that are still a part of the social safety net for millions of people with disabilities is based on income and asset limits. It's based on a poverty standard, and yet they really don't take into account that rather significant gap that Steve and Zach have identified with this preliminary research that might in fact allow tens of thousands of individuals with disabilities who right now are deemed not poor enough to be eligible for these public benefits like food and housing assistance, changes in eligibility for Medicaid, but for if we were to factor in these extra costs, it probably clearly would expand who is eligible and provide a greater social safety net to help thousands more people with disabilities. So that's one area to think about. A second is changes to the tax code. Nanette mentioned that certainly the whole orientation of ABLE accounts, achieving a better life experience accounts that were created some 5 years plus ago with bipartisan support was about helping individuals with disabilities, helping families raising children with disabilities to be able to put money aside without in any way adversely impacting, for the most part, eligibility for federal public benefits that are means tested. So an ABLE account is not an asset, and it opens up a way people can deal with extra costs. But there are two other aspects of ABLE accounts we're thinking about. One right now is that who is eligible. Age of onset of disability must be age 26 or younger, very arbitrary. We know there are people who may become disabled by accident, health condition, or maybe even fighting on behalf of our country, become a wounded warrior, who are not eligible for this tax advantage savings account. So it could be about changing who's eligible. It also could be about changing the amount of money annually that could be placed in an ABLE account, whether it's saving for short-term needs, emergency needs that hard to anticipate, but they occur, certainly like COVID and other things, or it's saving for longer term needs. So there are multiple ways to think about changing the way an ABLE account might work. The ABLE account is Section 529A of the tax code. And there may be other ways of looking at the tax code that might really help people with disabilities recognize these extra costs. They're not all medical costs, but there are these extra costs, and so another area of public policy development. And then a third, more on the private sector side, is the numerous people in this country families with a family member with a disability use financial planners, have opened and use the financial planner expertise to manage special needs trusts, as well as people who contribute to pooled income trusts. And these extra costs, as we dig deeper with hopefully the next set of studies, answering some of the questions that Zach and Steve said we do not yet know from this first study, it may require recalculation of financial needs, both short and long term, which may change what the whole calculus is in terms of what a family is saving for a family member with a disability for the future. It also may lead to changing what might be the savings and investment choices as well, based on a deeper understanding per individual and per individual family about that family member with a disability. So these are some things to think about. This first study really takes us down what I hope is a path of many other studies to come. Next slide, please. So let me turn back to Zach and Steve, because I hope I've set it up for this study, so important, but where do we next need to go? What are the additional research areas that need to be pursued?
Well, thank you, Michael. Stephen, we can do this together, but I want to thank Michael for those policy thoughts and for his discussion of this. I think for the future, and I do think this is just a first study, and we need more. We need to build this research foundation. I think a big question is identifying the specific kinds of costs that are driving these items, right? In conducting mixed methods research to understand these hard to measure costs and how people's lived experience. We need to understand the kinds of supports and services that help reduce the extra cost of disability, which means promising interventions. And both, I think, would be very informative for policymakers in trying to find levers that could improve circumstances, to know, what's causing the costs and also what's alleviating costs, and would be very helpful. Stephen, do you want to add other thoughts?
Yeah, I think we have a pretty succinct list of goals here for kind of what our next steps would be. And you kind of touched on all of those, but I just wanted to reiterate the importance of one of the things in the next steps being to really try to understand the lived experiences of people with disabilities and how their lives are impacted by these extra costs, so that we can kind of go further than just putting a number on it, so we can start to identify what those extra costs are.
Right, and to bring awareness to this problem. I think one thing, as someone who's done a lot of research internationally and is very familiar with the international research literature, there's far more attention, I think, to this issue, to the extra cost of disability in other countries than in our own. And we hope that this gets the conversation started. And I think to piggyback on Stephen, getting that lived experience, and we'll ask you to fill out the survey next, is part of that, in hearing your stories and hearing about all the ways you're financially impacted and the financial expenses that you might have due to your disability.
So it's really a great point. I want to bring it back to that lived experience, and I'm going to come back to you, Steve and Zach, in a moment, in terms of how people can help promote and participate in this type of research in the future. But I want to introduce to everyone now a further guest, and someone who I've gotten to know, Edward Mitchell. Edward, I have gotten to know because he is an ABLE account owner, and the National Disability Institute and our ABLE National Resource Center has done a lot of work on promoting and learning about the ABLE account owner experience, challenges, as well as benefits. We thought, just as we shared with you at the beginning of this webinar, Amy Gatlin's personal experience, I wanted to turn to Edward. And Edward, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
So Edward, can you share a little bit about, tell people about your life circumstance, a little bit about, you haven't been disabled your whole life, different than Amy's story. And tell us a little bit about how that life experience has changed you and led to you on a regular basis having to deal with out-of-pocket extra costs.
Oh, yes, most certainly, Michael. Again, I'm Edward Mitchell. I'm a member of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. I currently work 2 jobs, one as a fan relations coordinator for a AA minor league baseball team. I'm also employed by our local Center for Independent Living as an independent living specialist. And I also sit on the statewide Independent Living Council, which is governor appointed on my 2nd term. I completed my undergraduate degree at a private HBCU, Lane College here in Jackson, Tennessee. And I got my master's from Union University here in Jackson as well. My injury occurred on March 29th, 2003, when I was a victim of a hit and run accident. I was riding my bike near a cornfield. My little brother went back to air up his tire. I noticed a truck approaching too fast behind me. I gave the hand signals, I switched lanes, and that's when the truck clipped me from behind and tossed me in the cornfield for my brother to find me. This has had a tremendous impact on my life because it not only changed my life, but it affected my little brother as well as my mother and father, because this happened in between my 10th grade and 11th grade year into high school. It changed the trajectory of how I operate. It changed the way I participated in band, how I participated in sports, family vacations, but also things that I enjoyed personally, such as climbing trees, bowling, dirt bike riding, go-kart riding. So all these things were changed just because of this one incident of having a hit and run accident. And also it changed the way that my parents operated and, impacted their professional careers.
And Edward, let's focus in on disability related extra costs. What are some costs you have been dealing with in your day-to-day existence?
My day-to-day existence is I'm actually have finished purchasing my 2nd wheelchair accessible van after a 2-year battle with VR to cover the cost of the modifications. A wheelchair van cost with hand controls can be near $150,000, and VR will cover the modifications, but the out-of-pocket van cost is on myself. So I just finished that, getting a 2020 Honda Touring Elite. Other disability costs that come into play are such as items that you use for your nightly routine, such as your bowel program, nursing care, but also the maintenance of a wheelchair accessible vehicle, which can become astronomical as the years go on.
And are there extra costs that or expenses you defer now for the future that has an impact on your quality of life? Yes,
any individual that's a chair user, we have gone through 2 sets of laminate flooring in my room because we originally started off with carpet. We're eventually going to move to maybe a bamboo style hardwood. And just because of that cost, those are something that you defer to later on. We actually deferred getting a wheelchair accessible shower because we found a way to get into the bathtub. But that was something that we've just recently covered. But again, it's 2020. My injury happened in 2003. So we just had to find a way to adapt and make things work until we could get a roll-in shower.
And you're still living with your parents?
Yes, sir.
Do you foresee the possibilities and probably extra costs for you to live on your own?
Yeah. Yes. Well, I'm living in rural West Tennessee, and even though I have my master's, I've had to turn down jobs due to geographical limitations, such as being there a lot of snow, a lot of ice, but also looking at nursing care costs. Is there a wheelchair manufacturer that can provide the needs I need for my wheelchair or wheelchair van? So I am currently saving now that I've accomplished my short-term goal of purchasing my 2nd wheelchair accessible vehicle. Now I can use my Great Able account to keep saving for that long-term goal of home ownership, because like my peer group are already on their second homes or first homes, and I want to be able to enter that and kind of keep up with my peers.
Right. And from your personal experience, and I appreciate you really sharing with the many people who are listening on this webinar. As you've listened to the research study and their findings, you work in an independent living center. You see people with disabilities every day. You're in a peer support role. Can you think about additional ways we should be looking perhaps at policy changes that would better help you and others that you know through the Independent Living Center in the future?
Policy changes that I would like to see change would be maybe a universal vocational rehabilitation center, vocational rehabilitation, because some states have a easier access to second modifications and those things. But also maybe those that are on waiver programs, such as myself, where I get nursing care, maybe something of a sliding scale where the higher I progress in my career field, the more I contribute to the system. It's kind of a shared cost with nursing instead of being pigeonholed into staying below an income source resource in order to qualify for those programs. And also the expansion of the ABLE program. It is great, but also to get people, that are a little bit older that are not qualifying for ABLE. But those three things I think can definitely be beneficial to improving individuals' quality of lives, but also not totally depleting the people such as my parents, who have been a tremendous backbone and helpful in my life and matriculation.
Fantastic. Edward, thank you. And I appreciate your willingness and openness and sharing. You've made amazing strides in terms of post that accident back when you're in high school. I know because we've talked multiple times. You didn't just graduate from college. I believe you got an advanced degree as well.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
And you're actually supporting lots of other folks with disabilities through the Independent Living Center in Tennessee, which is important. Thank you. I'm going to turn us back to Zach and Stephen. I believe if there was another slide, not this one, where, nope, I think it's earlier than this one. There we go. And Zach or Steve, can you tell people a little bit about this?
Yeah, sure. So we would invite people on the webinar today who identify as a person with a disability to take a brief survey. It should take no more than 10 minutes. And it just kind of asks about some of your extra costs that maybe you would experience because of your disability. So it asks about those disability related expenses, in addition to asking about some questions about ABLE accounts and also around your experience with extra costs and the pandemic. So again, it's a very short survey lasting no more than 10 minutes. And we'll put the link here. We'll drop the link in a couple more places as well so that you'll be able to access that. Nanette, do you know where else the link would be by any chance? Or not to put Nanette on the spot.
Yes, so it's going to be in the chat. It will also be in the follow-up email that you receive after the webinar. And at the end of the webinar, if everything goes well, you should be flipped to a page that asks you if you want to participate in this survey.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you for that. Next slide, please. Yes, so I know as you've listened to the group of presenters, did some questions come in through the chat box? And we'd like to take some of those up.
And Michael, did you get those questions?
I'm looking for them now.
Okay, well, let me pose a question.
Okay.
So first of all, we had asked Edward if he had any policy recommendations, and I'm wondering if I can turn back to Amy and see if she has any policy recommendations. Way to put you on the spot, huh?
Yeah, I hadn't really thought of that, but I think that honestly, there should probably be some tax deductions for medical expenses at all income levels. for disability for anyone in the household. I think that would be helpful. And I think probably income should be adjusted for all different calculations for those extra expenses. Don't know how that would actually be implemented, but I think it makes sense.
Okay, thanks. And then I'm going to pose a question to myself, which one of the questions was, are there any studies that focus on opportunity loss? For example, parents who leave work. And I don't actually have those off the top of my head, but I think, you know, we talked about this research being about the out-of-pocket costs of disability. So Edward mentioned a lot about the opportunity costs, lost income for his family members, lost income for himself. And those numbers come out on the income side of the equation. So they don't really get captured in this extra out-of-pocket costs. But it's important to sort of keep those two things separate, that like Zach talked about earlier, that there's, you know, loss of income and extra expenditures. Another thing that I thought Edward explained incredibly well is in our current system, you know, there are people who have extra costs that are really extraordinary, and there's pretty much no job that's going to give you enough income to cover that. So you have to sort of tie yourself up into knots and limit your work activity so that you can continue to be qualified to have some of those extra costs covered. And that's one of the, you know, a big initiative that a lot of countries are trying to take, where they sort of delink this, delink disability benefits or and work, so that you can be covering the extra costs regardless of work status. And so,
Nanette,
did you get the questions?
Yes, I did, and so I'm ready to continue.
Okay, good.
I see several, but first I want to ask one of my own, and it's a question to Stephen and Zach. You know, we are in this critical period of time where probably in my lifetime the greatest exploration of equity and equality issues, particularly with people of color. And I wondered, were you able, and maybe the sample was, you know, the sample from the different data sources didn't enable this to be broken down. But the question is, would this extra cost create a further discrepancy for people with disabilities who are also people of color? I saw with gender, there was not a significant difference, but were you able to pursue that, or would that be yet another of next generation studies?
Yeah, Michael, so thank you for that question. I think it's a really, really important question for all the reasons that you stated. And it's certainly something we wanted to analyze, and we attempted to analyze, but you kind of hit the nail on the head in terms of there just wasn't a large enough sample in either of the data sets, any of the data sets we looked at, to draw any sort of statistically significant conclusion around that question. And so we ended up not being able to include that in the final paper, unfortunately, but it certainly is and should be on the agenda for future research.
Okay. There are several questions that came in. One question is about maybe perhaps more of a statement that expressing appreciation of learning about this research, but also wondering, how do we get the public agencies, the Medicaid agencies, vocational rehabilitation agencies, to understand this research, which should be a part of their developing a plan of support for their customers, clients, individuals they're trying to support. That's more about knowledge translation and outreach. But I'm also wondering, is what you don't know you were able to look at, but also another very much target audience are what's happening to youth as they transition out of access to public education, and then the safety net isn't as clear. Would that be yet another study which would focus on particularly perhaps an age group? I'm not sure what the age point should be, but maybe it's 15 to 23 or something like that.
This is Zach. I think on the first thing, this is the ADA 30-year anniversary, and we know that the economic development promise of the ADA was one of those promises that was least fulfilled. And I think when we look at the U.S. context and we look at the myriad of supports available, the term that comes to mind, and I was talking about this with Nanette, is piecemeal, right? It's just all these different agencies providing some supports here and there to cover the extra cost expenses, but there's no uniform coverage. There's no, as she talked about in Britain or Australia, there's no specific program or service that is devoted to the extra costs of living with a disability. And I think the more that our research can just bring attention to the need for, concerted attention to the issue, I think the better, whether it's cross-agency discussions about improving services and supports or providing a more effective means of covering the extra costs of living with a disability, and just realizing that people have many out-of-pocket expenses that are not provided for. And on the age question, I think that's a big avenue for our future research, is looking, we're only looking at working age adults in this study. I think looking at, youth, the cost on having a child with a disability, or looking at the changes of having a disability as they develop over a lifetime, and how costs come into play with transition age youth is a good example. Also looking at our aging population with the disabilities and what costs they encounter. These are all avenues, I think, for future research agenda on the extra costs in the U.S.
Yeah, I want to take you back to a point you made that should not be left unattended and worthy of further discussion. You made the statement that this type of research, of course, you were borrowing a methodology that has been used outside the U.S. That's part one. But what you said is the body of research in this country, despite the amount of millions of dollars that's spent every year in the National Institutes of Health, within the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living and Rehabilitation Research. There's research being funded by Social Security, by Office of Disability Employment Policy at Department of Labor. Is why in the world has there not been more focus on this when it clearly has such profound implications in terms of both policy change, but also life experience?
Well, I couldn't agree with you more, and I think I think there's a dependent variable problem, to use a statistical language, where there's just the research focus is typically on employment and disability, and not on poverty, not on deprivation, not on extra costs of living. I don't know why that is, or why the focus has not been on these critical questions of are people able to make ends meet? What kind of challenges they have? But I think there's a need for more attention on these different outcomes. And obviously there's a lot of research out there, but I think we definitely have a focus oriented towards employment as our primary outcome measure versus poverty, well-being, standard of living in our studies in this country. Right.
Okay. Let me. I'm just trying to think. It's fascinating, as you said. This is the 30th anniversary year of the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And as you mentioned, one of its promises and goals was to advance economic self-sufficiency, which of course also was about focusing on the income production side. There isn't, except underneath the overall purpose of the ADA to improve quality of life experience, there really was not a focus on that fundamentally people with disabilities today, 30 years later, are, and this is pre-COVID and the pandemic, we're living at in a rate of poverty without the extra cost factor far greater than people without disabilities. And when we look at the intersection of people of color and disability, the numbers get even worse. And so it seems so important, and why I'm so thankful to the FINRA Foundation for supporting this research. I hope it's like opening a door, and that it interests both other researchers, but also always researchers need funders. So I hope we're going to get the attention of funders as well. Another thing to look at is you and other researchers are going to have a huge sample of people. We're soon to approach 100,000 people with ABLE accounts who have set aside almost $500 million in those accounts, who are regularly using monies out of those accounts for improving quality of life experience, and I think it's fair to say covering extra costs of living with a disability. So there may be opportunities for collaboration that we haven't seen yet. Nanette, I'm going to go to you. You say there's some further questions, and I'm going to go to you rather than for me to look for them.
Okay, we've got a lot of policy suggestions, actually. Have you considered delinking Social Security from Medicare and Medicaid and expanding healthcare for all to include long-term community-based services? There's suggestions around, there's actually a question about how do I find somebody who can help manage or figure out what rules there are for special needs trusts, supplemental needs trusts, and ABLE accounts. I've asked many financial professionals over the years, but no one seems to know enough about it to help me manage these kind of expenditures and savings mechanisms. Do you want to go with that? Or actually, maybe the FINRA Foundation can answer that.
I can really.
You can answer that?
We get those questions often because of the focus of National Disability Institute on trying to promote better informed financial decisions and advance people's financial health for both families and individuals with disabilities. And I would encourage them to write us directly in terms of there are a group of financial advisors who just have exclusively focused on being responsive to people with disabilities and families. And so love to talk, offline about that rather than certainly throw out suggestions here. But there is a growing large community of financial advisors and attorneys with quite a bit of information to help individuals and families with informed decision-making. On the other point, in terms of why don't we decouple some of the eligibility issues between Social Security and Medicaid, yes, of course we should. But I think the real point, and as we begin to come to the end here, and I'll ask Hope, why don't you pull up the slide that shows where people can access the papers. There we go. I think it's so important for all of us to think about pre-COVID, during COVID, and post-COVID, that extra costs are a part of life experience for people across quite a spectrum, maybe the full spectrum of disability. We need to learn so much more about it. It needs to inform our public policy. But as I think Zach and Steve said, what we have is a patchwork quilt of policy in the US with at times both disconnected and adverse goals literally conflicting with each other. We, despite an ADA of 30 years ago, we still are not paying enough attention to poverty reduction strategies, providing a social safety net that recognizes these extra costs and give individuals like Edward and others the chance to earn more without critical loss of health benefits and all other benefits that are absolutely essential for them to have a more independent life. So we've got a long way to go, and it's why I think this first study in the U.S. and again, my appreciation to the research team, because hopefully for funders, public and private, for agencies that are making decisions about who they're supporting with people with disabilities, this is eye-opening, and this should really change and help us evolve policy development and program development in the future. On the screen is the links to the policy brief and extra costs of living with a disability in the US, resetting the policy table, and also the working paper that has been presented today. I'm just going to ask if any of our presenters, I'll start with Steve or Zach, any closing thoughts for our audience?
Yeah, I think for me, Michael, this is Stephen, by the way. I wanted to just really quickly touch back and make a comment about something you mentioned previously. One of the questions came in that mentioned, how do we get this research out to agencies? And I just wanted to emphasize the importance of collaboration and partnership, similar to what we've done in this project. Partnering as two researchers, Zach and I, from universities, partnering with NDI, a nonprofit in the community, and partnering with the FINRA Foundation to really create research and then make it accessible to the public. So oftentimes in academia, we produce research that is oftentimes sits behind paywalls in academic journals and isn't very accessible. And so this has kind of been really nice and a breath of fresh air to be able to partner and collaborate with you all and make this available freely online.
Great. Nanette, any closing comment?
No, I'll just second what Stephen said. I think it was a really wonderful collaboration between NDI and university researchers. And I think to extend, I think, the challenge of bringing data and policy together, goes on all the time. So I think the question here is, how do we take these findings and bring them into a policy context, and more importantly, make policy change? We gave some examples of things that were going on in other countries, and as one of the commenters in the chat box mentioned, those are not uncontroversial. We're not saying that that's the direction that we should go, only that this is a really, really compelling problem. And we need to sort of figure out how to move forward on making change.
Okay. And Amy or Edward, any closing thoughts to share with the audience?
This is Amy. On my side, I'm definitely sharing this information with the people within my company and all of the disability networks and things like that, because it's really illuminating and gives data to something that we all inherently knew to be true, but now that it's measured, it makes it seem more real to us. So thank you for doing that.
Thank you, Amy, for joining us. Edward, any closing thoughts?
Closing thoughts, I would just encourage every individual to do their part. We all have family members, friends, or maybe people we've encountered through high school, middle school that have a disability. Befriend them, try to see what's going on in their life, and try to get in those positions to where you can enact change and really show that I'm a part of this and I definitely wanted to affect change.
Fantastic. I believe Gerri may have had to go, so we'll not call on her, but thank her again for being the funder of this important research. And thank all of you for joining us today. Please do read the policy brief and working paper and look at possibly helping gather more data, the link to the survey that can help further this type of research to keep going. And please do not hesitate to contact any of us with further questions or even opportunities for collaboration. We certainly would look forward to it. So with that, I think I'm going to sign off. Thank you all for joining us today. It's been a wonderfully informative webinar, insightful comments, and I hope we've given everyone much to think about and act on in the future. Have a great day. Thanks, everyone. Take care.